Hi, everybody. I'm Diane Brady. I'm here with Ian Bremmer, who is president and founder of Eurasia Group and G0 Media. Of course, noted political scientist. Ian, thanks for joining us.
Sure, good to be here.
So let's start with this deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran that's been brokered by China. This seems to get into your maximum Xi thesis that you had earlier this year. What do you make of it?
Well, two big things. First of all, inconceivable that the Chinese would have been involved, never mind taking a leadership role in a diplomatic deal like this 3 years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago. Xi Jinping has decided that he really wants to be seen as a global leader / peacemaker. He's about to go to Moscow. He's about to do a video call with the Ukrainian president. They rolled out that 12-point peace plan for Russia and Ukraine. So this is new Xi Jinping, right? On the other hand, Biden, who has done reasonably well with European allies, reasonably well with Asian allies, has been abysmal with Middle Eastern allies, particularly Gulf Arab allies. You'll remember that was the first trip that Trump made as president was to Saudi Arabia, where he grabbed the orb. Biden fist bumped, didn't go so well with Mohammed bin Salman. And Biden has, his view of the world is we're fighting a battle between democracies and autocracies. Well, there aren't exactly a lot of democracies in the Middle East. That creates a lot of space.
So
for
basically,
someone like Xi Jinping.
He's recused himself. I'm looking at your tweet that you had. Sure, Trump left the oven on, but the house didn't burn down till Joe moved in. So you really think of Joe Biden as the one who has, in essence, created a more volatile situation for the U.S.
It's very funny that you picked on that post because that post can be read many ways. The reason I posted it is because so much of what we see online is through a distinctly partisan lens. And so you have a lot of people out there that if it's not their side, they're just going to make the argument against, and it doesn't matter if the same thing had happened before. And so you could make that argument about the Middle East, in which case, the fact is that Trump had a better relationship, Biden had much worse. You could focus on the Europeans, you could focus on the big banking meltdown and who's the one that actually made the rules easier for these banks.
We'll get to that.
All of these things. The point is that we need to respond as a country. And the United States today is not responding as a country. And it's precisely the fact that a lot of leaders around the world aren't sure if they can count on a United States from one administration to the next that makes them a lot more unsure about the nature of American diplomatic leadership. And we're seeing that play out with the Saudis and the Iranians right now.
Well, from where you sit, this vilification of China, whether justified or not, we've got, the discussions around TikTok, Huawei, Xi Jinping, what's happening in the region. What, if you're a business leader, talking to our audience, should you be worried? Certainly we've seen Washington be worried, but when you're talking to business leaders who are dealing with supply chain, wondering about trade, trying to figure out where to grow, what to make of what's happening, regardless of, he's in his third term. What's your message? What's your interpretation? And what are you hearing from the private sector around what's going on?
Most business leaders don't want a fight between the United States and China. There are some that are national champions of the United States, the Lockheed equivalents, right? For them, it's not such an issue. For those that are betting all in on the Americans and American allies, increasingly you'll see some companies like that in the tech sector, for example. But broadly speaking, that's not the group. Broadly speaking, what you're seeing is a group of CEOs that are signing on to a letter that I've recently seen from Hank Greenberg,
former
AIG, who is trying to say, hey, it's a letter to Biden and Xi Jinping. It's going to be made public, I think, in the Wall Street Journal, saying, please, it's the most important relationship. We need you talking. We need you engaging with each other. It's a perfectly anodyne letter. I think most people would support it, but it shows that they're worried. A lot of CEOs are worried. I've seen the Business Council in the United States, group of CEOs, same sort of initiative. So the business community isn't happy about this. Now, the problem is Biden's policy towards China, in theory, is a policy that would align very well with the US business community. It's a 3-bucket policy. It says there's some areas, the most important relationship in the world, most important geopolitically, economically.
Yeah.
There are some areas that we will be adversaries. There's some where we'll be competitors, but with a fair playing field. And there's some where we'll be friends, where we'll cooperate, climate change, for example. Here's the problem, is that in the present political environment, everything that Biden is doing that is in the adversarial bucket, he's all in. And all of the stuff that's in the competitive and the cooperative buckets, he in principle wants to do, but he doesn't actually do because it's politically harmful, playing to his base, playing to politics in a political cycle. So what you end up with, if you could easily imagine that the United States would have a policy of Taiwan, we're going to be all in favor of ensuring that the Chinese are not going to change the status quo. Semiconductors for dual use military purposes, we are absolutely not going to let the Chinese gain investments in that area. We're going to be tough on those. Those are adversarial bucket. But with the Trump era tariffs that are not in any way strategically important for US national security, we're going to take them off, and the Chinese are going to take them off. And we're both going to grow, and the business community would love that. That is a policy that makes a lot of sense. In other words, provoke the Chinese when it's important, but do not engage in unnecessary provocation. So you got a balloon that goes over your country. You know it was a mistake that it actually flew there in terms of wind conditions. You don't need to blow it up. Biden wasn't going to blow it up until it became public. And then as soon as it became public, suddenly they canceled the trip. They've got to blow it up. That is a problem.
Well, China must realize it, first of all, because they've been dealing with this. But you think it's important that we have not been letting him save face with his own people with these public, very public pronouncements, very public attacks on Xi and democracy and everything else.
And I'll give you another example, which is when the United States got some intelligence that Xi Jinping was considering providing military support for the Russians. Clearly unacceptable for the U.S. What the U.S. could have done was made that very clear at the highest level, privately to the Chinese, share the intel, say, if this happens, here is what we will do. And not just us, but our allies. We've talked to them. Instead, what happened is public name and shame, US, NATO, UK, put the Chinese on notice the same way, the exact same way the US did with intelligence on Russia before they invaded in Ukraine in February 24th, a year ago. In other words, the American position is we're treating the Chinese the way we treat the pariahs, the Russians. And when Biden says democracies versus autocracies, same message. We're treating the Chinese the same way we treat the Russians. If you're China, that lack of respect, that lack of face, which is not aligned with Xi Jinping's personal relationship with Biden that goes back many years at this point, that's unacceptable. And that's precisely why Xi Jinping decided to make the unprecedented statements against the United States a week ago.
Yeah.
He's coming out of zero COVID. He feels like he's in a much stronger position. He's got his third term president for life all locked up. Chinese economy picking up again. It's not like he worries particularly about domestic approval at home. He's got an authoritarian regime, but he also sees a majority of the world's population is increasingly aligned with peace, as opposed to the United States and Europe seen as more hypocritical from the perspective of the global South. So Xi Jinping is making a structural play here. And it's deeply problematic for the United States.
Well, I think that's what's interesting, the consequences. And we can shift to Europe, but I'm used to there being this parallel, the rhetoric being one level, but then the reality on the ground being very different. You're saying it's changed now. And even let's take globalization, a slight aside. There's this sense that the U.S. is not engaged in globalization anymore, yet it's hosting APEC this year. We've seen NATO become much stronger, as you've pointed out, during the Ukraine crisis. How well does it play in the U.S. to be talking about engaging globally, on a business level? It just seems like that's one of the issues in terms of how it's being translated to the common folk here.
Well, it's interesting. Because the United States is still by far the world's superpower from a national security perspective,
Yeah.
outspending everybody and has the military leadership. And there is general support for US policy on Russia, Ukraine, which
Yeah.
is multilateral and aligned with the European allies. There's general support, strong support for US policy on China that's aligning AUKUS. We've got, right now,
Yep.
Biden meeting with both the UK and the Australian leadership in San Diego. And we've also got the Quad, and India's engaged. So from a national security perspective, it seems to work. But you're not asking about that. You're saying, well, wait a second. What about globalization? What about trade? What about market access? And it turns out that a lot of Americans say we haven't benefited from those trade deals. Like, a lot of people got rich and the global economy grew and maybe the US economy grew. But what about us? Why should we care about that? And there hasn't been a good argument for that. So whether it's Trump's America First or it's Biden's US foreign policy for the American middle class, market access is no longer a lever the Americans can use to talk about globalization. So instead, what you see the Americans doing on trade and the economy is say, well, let's take those areas of the economy that we can define as national security adjacent and get our allies on board on that. So friendshoring. Don't want to do anything in China. Let's do more
That's not a term
with
I've heard,
the Mexicans, for example. Nearshoring, friendshoring,
Yeah,
there's a lot of talk about that. You hear that from Secretary Raimondo, you see it from Gretchen Whitmer, but Republicans talking about it too. I was just in Mexico a couple of weeks ago, and all the CEOs, every single one, brings up nearshoring because they're saying, well, no, it's not going to be China. So in that regard, national security, it's going to be more here, right? You'll also see coordination on semiconductors with the Dutch, with the Japanese, with the South Koreans. You've got this CHIPS 4 agreement. You've got alignment with allies because national security defines the semiconductor issue more than just openness and free trade. So the Americans, everything's a hammer, looks like a nail. We've got a big national security hammer, so let's talk about more nails. And if you can't do a Trans-Pacific partnership, which is what America's allies want the United States in, then at least you can talk about other aspects of the global economy that get some of these folks on board. But that's not globalization, right?
No, it's
and
very
the
different.
corporations don't like that because it's not as efficient, it's not as global.
Yeah, and everything becomes political. Let me...
but one other thing I should mention,
No, please.
which is that let's also be clear that part of the reason that American firms are slowing down their Chinese investment is because they're concerned about US-driven risk with China. Part of it is because they're concerned about China's lack of transparency, the lack of rule of law, the fact that China's corporations are aligned with the government and they're a lot stronger than they used to be, the fact that China no longer has the labor cost advantages that they used to, and these companies don't need as much labor. So some of this nearshoring, some of this reversal of globalization would be coming even if you had the most articulate strategic US policy towards China imaginable. And we need to understand that too.
Before we get to what's happening here, I want to ask about Putin, which was, I believe, your number one threat earlier this year was a rogue Russia.
Yeah.
How is this deal? Let's go back to what she's doing and Saudi Arabia and Iran. How does that impact Russia? And I know there's been closer alliances between Russia and China. What do you see playing out there?
I think the fact that the Chinese are more willing to say that the US is engaged in escalating with support for Ukraine, with sanctions against Russia, that is something that makes the Chinese feel more comfortable. They have cover to now have Xi Jinping make a trip to Moscow and say, okay, we're buddies, let's work on a whole bunch of other stuff. They wouldn't have said that 3 or 6 months ago. The American narrative was doing better in that environment. It's an interesting point. Clearly, I'm not sympathetic to China's argument here because the Russians invaded this country illegally. And a large majority of the world's governments, not just US allies, but everyone, are on record in the United Nations General Assembly 3 times condemning this invasion and saying the Russians need to withdraw immediately. But when Xi Jinping goes and talks to Putin, he's not going to say that. He's going to say, let's have a ceasefire. He's going to say, let's talk about finding a way to just end this war.
Is that the end game? Can we perhaps have China broker some sort of deal in the same way it brokered a deal in the Middle East? Is that?
I think that's absolutely unacceptable for the Ukrainians, and it's absolutely unacceptable for NATO. Now, the Ukrainians are still getting an enormous amount of military support from the United States. And as long as that continues, and as long as the Europeans continue to be fundamentally aligned, in 10 rounds of sanctions now, 27 European Union countries have all voted in favor of every single one of those rounds, even the Hungarians, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think as long as Ukraine has that level of support, the possibility that China is going to make a deal here happen is virtually zero. But let's imagine a situation where suddenly the Americans don't provide as much support with the 2024 election coming up. Let's imagine a situation where Trump, for example, gets the nomination and is saying this.
Is
we
that
don't want
likely
World
from
War.
where you sit?
I mean, from the Republican side, I mean, he's the most popular person. If you were to have a vote today, he'd win. I don't know, but it's certainly a risk, right?
Yeah.
So I'm just saying that on Russia-Ukraine, the Ukrainians have a lot of uncertainty about how much support they're going to get in 2024. 2025. And the Chinese are not thinking about the next 6 months.
Well, and the European support's been more on the energy side than it has on the military side, right?
Yes. I mean, the Europeans are paying an inordinate amount for this war.
Yeah.
Mostly they're paying to cut off the Russians in terms of their energy supply.
Yeah.
They're not paying so much for military support for Ukraine. But the point is that support is fully aligned. If that starts to erode and the Ukrainians suddenly aren't performing as well on the ground, and let's see what the counteroffensive in the coming weeks for Ukraine looks like. So there's a lot of uncertainty here. But if you're Russia, if you're China, you're thinking about time not being on Ukraine's side. You're looking for any fracture, any break inside the NATO alliance, and you're going to throw all the disinformation you can into that, and you're going to say, this is hurting the global economy, the sanctions are hurting the developing world. India, you're not on side. Brazil. I mean, that Chinese peace plan, which the Ukrainians hated, which the Americans hated, but if you didn't know the Chinese had written it, could have been written by India, Mexico, Brazil, Turkey.
So the end game is to wait it out basically until we see what's happening. I mean, does it go into 2024? I mean, I don't know. Again, I don't want to cover the whole landscape here, but from where you sit, what would you be watching in the next few weeks with regard to what's happening in Ukraine since it's so top of mind?
Well, in the near term, you're watching for, do the Ukrainians get the ammunition they need to be able to both do this counteroffensive in the coming weeks, April, May latest, and they need a lot. And the Americans don't have it, right? The Americans have some, but they're going to have to get it from all over the world. The amount that's required is 750,000 155 millimeter rounds. That's a lot, right?
Yeah.
And then you need to know, also, do they get air defense ammunition to ensure that the Russians can't use their jet fighters? They've got like 700 jet fighters. They haven't been able to use them in the war since the first days because the Ukrainians will shut them down. So first we need to see that, and then we need to see how successful the Ukrainian counteroffensive is. And if it's very successful, if they're able to break the land bridge between Russia and Crimea, then suddenly the Ukrainians might be much more willing to engage in negotiations because they would have the upper hand in terms of Russia's ability to even continue to provide supply for Crimea, which is a red line for the Russians. If, on the other hand, they're much less successful than that, we see the Ukrainians get bogged down. We see the Russians do another call up of a couple 100,000 more troops. And suddenly the Americans are more uncertain about 2024 support on the back of a debt limit crisis in the US this summer, with elections coming up, the Europeans starting to get a little squishy, some of them saying, like Macron did back in the G20 in Bali, hey, we'd like the Chinese to help. Suddenly, China's call for a ceasefire might seem a lot more attractive to a lot of people. So this is really in play right now.
Yeah. No, very interesting. And so let me, here in the US, I'd be remiss not to ask you about your views of Silicon Valley Bank, the FDIC stepping in, Signature Bank. There are some similarities with 2008. What do you make of it, and what are you hearing? I mean, it's early days yet, but curious to get your perspective on how that's...
I'm not an economist, right? So first of all, I'm not going to second guess someone like Janet Yellen. There are a lot of people on Wall Street that are good at that. That's not me. I think an interesting point broadly is that in a higher interest rate environment where a lot of big investors are worried about risk, this is not the first thing we've seen. We saw challenges. You remember when Liz Truss was prime minister for those glorious couple of weeks. She was hammered by the markets that were taking a risk-off position, said, no, we're just not going to let you start putting all this money on the table and not have it funded. A lot of emerging market debt, same thing. So for me, this risk for Silicon Valley Bank and maybe some of the regional banks too is part of that broader structural play that just the world is a lot riskier. People are looking for quality and safety. They're looking for the dollar. They're looking for, strategic banks that actually play with Dodd-Frank. They're worried about other stuff. And frankly, a Silicon Valley bank, it looks a lot more like Liz Truss and some EM debt that's dollarized and that doesn't have, sort of great governance behind it than it looks like, your big JP Morgans out there. And I think that's a big piece of why we saw this.
So finally, because you get into rooms we don't get to go, I'm curious if you're hearing anything that's on your radar that you would put on ours, or even if your views coming into 2023 have shifted at all by the events of the last couple of months. What's on your radar right now besides what we have talked about? I know you've got many different topics, AI, et cetera, but you are generally pretty optimistic about the U.S. economy.
Yeah,
Does
definitely.
that continue to be the case?
Yeah, I think so. Again, cleanest dirty shirt argument, demographics. I mean, China has far greater headwinds than the United States does, and I think that matters.
Yeah.
I guess I would say I'm growing in my concern about the rift between the US and its allies and the global South, the developing world. The level of anger I am hearing when I talk to leaders from emerging markets around the world.
Anger against the US?
Anger about hypocrisy, anger about, you're telling us to support Ukraine, you give $100 billion to Ukraine because they're white people. But what about brown people? You don't care as much about brown. Your revealed preferences on brown people just isn't very impressive. And they saw that with vaccines in the response to the pandemic. They're seeing it now on Russia, Ukraine. They're seeing it on climate change in a big way. And when I think about the need to have global solutions to global problems, coupling the US-China, sort of fireworks on the headlines, and then underneath that, the United States aligned much more with the G7, aligned much more with NATO, but really not aligned at all with all of these developing countries, many of whom are democracies. Yeah. But they're like, no, you might say it's democracies versus autocracies, but we don't feel like you mean it. We feel like that's performative. That's not really for us. And I think that's becoming a much bigger challenge in how I look at globalization. Your globalization questions to me were a lot about US versus China. My globalization challenges are much deeper about what happens with the majority of the world's population, who increasingly also aren't big buyers of the way that we've defined globalization for decades.
And that big jump in prosperity we've seen over the past generation is not continuing apace. That's part of the problem.
For them.
Yeah.
And it used to be, I mean, when the American middle class, which is comparatively wealthy in the context of the world, said, no, we're losing our jobs. At that point, you had a growing global middle class that felt very good about globalization trends. The last 3 years, you've had 5 years of reversion to the mean. You've had 5 years of lack of progress for the global middle class, and they're getting angrier, and their governments are under more political pressure. And I mean, if you want to try to get to 1.5 or 2 degrees of global warming as opposed to 2.5 or 3, you can't have that. So we're going to face much greater global costs and lack of efficiency in politics and geopolitics are going to insert themselves into big business decisions in a way that we're not going to like.
Great. Oh, one last question. Anybody, any contenders out there, any politicians that are actually recognizing this and you're hearing it in their rhetoric about these risks, or is everybody essentially playing to their own base and it's not being discussed, what you just...
Look, I mean, when I spend time in Washington, so many people understand these things, but that doesn't mean that they're going to drive decisions.
Yeah.
No, and publicly too. I mean, if I think of the last two senators I sat down with, Mitt Romney, Chris Coons,
Sure.
different political parties, both completely understand these challenges, but they do not reflect the base of their political parties.
Yeah.
I mean, even seeing on Russia-Ukraine, the difference between what McConnell and McCarthy have been saying that they're literally, when it comes to Russia, they're on Team Biden. It's an extraordinary thing for both of them to say, and yet you won't see Trump saying it, or Pompeo, or DeSantis. They know, right? They know what they're fighting for. So that the fact that the Democrats versus Republicans today are self-sorting in a way that doesn't reflect the population. The population in the United States is a bell curve. Most people in America, on issues like immigration, on issues like abortion, they're in the middle.
Yeah.
And that's the way the Senate plays, but that's not the way gerrymandering plays. That's not the way the House plays. That's not the way cable news plays. That's not the way social media plays. Then you'd think that the United States was hard on left and hard on right. And because that's what drives the money and the eyeballs, that's where the politics are. And so the average American citizen is particularly poorly served by the average American politician. And that is a deep, deep problem we have today.
Yeah. To be continued. Thanks for joining us, Ian.
My pleasure.